What history gets wrong about the Tudors? When you hear the name, the Tudors, what comes to mind? Perhaps it's Henry VIII the Beast, gluttonous, a womanizing tyrant. Or Anne Boleyn, the mysterious seductress with 6 fingers. Maybe Bloody Mary, burning hundreds at the stake. Or Elizabeth I, the virgin queen, ruling with a heart of stone. Popular history, novels, and television dramas like The Tudors have turned the Tudor dynasty into something between a soap opera and a fairy tale. But how much of what we think we know is actually true? Today, we're going to peel back the myths, the exaggerations, and the outright lies about one of England's most famous dynasties. By the end, you might see the Tudors not as stock characters in a melodrama, but as real people, complex, contradictory, and far more fascinating than fiction. So let's dive into 10 things history often gets wrong about the Tudors. Henry VIII was a jovial, fun-loving king who went mad because of syphilis. Henry VIII is one of history's most recognizable monarchs. Portraits show him as broad, larger-than-life, his eyes full of mischief. TV shows often depict him as a once-loving husband turned paranoid tyrant after contracting syphilis. But let's set the record straight. There is no evidence Henry VIII ever had syphilis. His medical records show no sign of mercury treatment, the standard for syphilis at the time, and no documented symptoms of the disease. The theory arose centuries later, long after his death, as historians tried to explain his increasingly erratic behavior. So, what really happened? In 1536, Henry suffered a serious jousting accident. His horse fell on him, leaving him unconscious for 2 hours. The resulting leg injury ulcerated and never fully healed. Chronic pain and immobility followed. He grew obese, possibly diabetic, and was prone to mood swings. But even before the accident, Henry was hardly the bluff King Hal of legend. Early in his reign, he authorized executions, including that of his father's financial ministers. The seeds of tyranny were always there, but age, pain, and politics brought them to full bloom. Anne Boleyn had 6 fingers and a witch's mark. Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, has been the subject of gossip for nearly 500 years. One of the most persistent myths is that she had 6 fingers on one hand and a large unsightly mole, or wen, on her neck. These claims came not from eyewitnesses but from Nicholas Sander, a Catholic propagandist writing decades after Anne's death. He described her as deformed, with a projecting tooth and extra finger, to portray her as a witch-like figure. But none of Anne's contemporaries, people who saw her daily at court, mentioned any physical deformity. On the contrary, they praised her grace and charm. In a time when physical anomalies were seen as signs of witchcraft or bad luck, it's highly unlikely she would have become queen if these rumors were true. This myth highlights how powerful women were often demonized in history, their reputation smeared to make political points. Anne's real story is far more compelling and tragic without the exaggerations. Anne of Cleves was the ugly Flanders Murray. When Henry VIII annulled his marriage to Anne of Cleves after just 6 months, the story spread that he called her a Flanders Murray. But did he? There's no contemporary evidence that Henry used this insult. The phrase doesn't appear in letters, records, or ambassadorial reports from the time. It first surfaced in the 17th century, more than 100 years later. In truth, Henry may have been disappointed when he first met Anne in person, since their betrothal had been arranged by portrait. But Anne was described by others as pleasant and modest, and she handled the annulment with remarkable dignity. She even became known as the king's beloved sister, and lived comfortably in England for the rest of her life. Bloody Mary was a sadistic queen who enjoyed burning Protestants. Mary I, Henry's eldest daughter, earned the nickname Bloody Mary for ordering the execution of nearly 300 Protestants during her 5-year reign. But was she truly a sadistic tyrant? The burnings happened, and they were horrific. Yet Mary's actions weren't born from sheer cruelty. She was determined to restore Catholicism in England after her father's break with Rome and her brother Edward's Protestant reforms. At the time, religious persecution was not uncommon on either side. Elizabeth I also executed Catholic priests and dissenters later in her reign. Mary also deserves credit for other achievements. She stabilized the currency, reformed the navy, and expanded trade. History remembers her for the fires of Smithfield, but forgets her work laying foundations her sister Elizabeth would later benefit from. Bloody Mary was a nickname born of Protestant propaganda, and it stuck. Lady Jane Grey was a helpless pawn in a power struggle. Lady Jane Grey, known as the 9 Days Queen, is often portrayed as a naive teenager manipulated by ambitious men. While Jane was certainly caught up in a dangerous game, she was not entirely passive. A highly educated and devout Protestant, she accepted the crown offered to her after Edward VI's death because she believed it was her duty to preserve the Protestant faith. When Mary Tudor gathered support and claimed the throne, Jane refused to convert to Catholicism, even under threat of death. She died at just 16, but with a courage and conviction that make her more than a mere pawn. Henry broke with Rome purely for Anne Boleyn. The popular version of history claims Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church simply because the Pope refused to grant him a divorce from Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn. But the reality is more complex. Henry's desire for a male heir was critical, but his break with Rome was also about power and money. By rejecting papal authority, Henry could seize church lands and wealth, consolidating his control over England. The dissolution of the monasteries brought enormous riches into royal coffers. Anne Boleyn was a catalyst, not the sole cause of the English Reformation. Tudors never bathed and lived in filth. We've all heard the stereotype: Tudor England was filthy and people rarely washed. This is partly false. While bathing wasn't as frequent as today, Tudors valued cleanliness. Wealthy people had private baths, used scented soaps, and washed their hands and faces daily. Public bathhouses had been popular before Henry VIII closed many over fears of disease. Toothbrushes existed, too often made with horsehair bristles, and people used herbs to freshen their breath. While sanitation was poor by modern standards, the dirty Tudors image is an exaggeration. The Tudor dynasty was a golden age of peace and stability. The Tudors are often credited with bringing stability to England after the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, but their reign wasn't entirely peaceful. Rebellions like the Pilgrimage of Grace and Wyatt's Rebellion threatened their rule. Religious turmoil under Henry, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth meant shifting laws and persecution for those on the wrong side of faith. For ordinary people, life could be brutal, with food shortages, plague, and poverty ever present. The Golden Age was real in terms of art, literature, and exploration, but it wasn't golden for everyone. Tudor women were passive and powerless. Popular portrayals often showed Tudor women as victims of powerful men. While gender constraints were real, some women exercised significant influence. Catherine of Aragon acted as regent while Henry campaigned in France and even raised troops to repel a Scottish invasion. Anne Boleyn advanced her family's fortunes and influenced religious reform. ElizabethI ruled for 45 years, crafting a carefully managed public image to strengthen her authority. Even lesser-known women like Bess of Hardwicke became powerful landowners and builders in their own right. Tudor women were far from powerless. TV and movies get the Tudors right. Dramas like The Tudors and Wolf Hall have captivated audiences, but they often take liberties. In The Tudors, Henry VIII never ages or gains weight. Key events are condensed or rewritten for drama. Even Wolf Hall, though more accurate, simplifies some relationships for storytelling. These shows have sparked interest in history, which is great. But remember, Entertainment is not always education. The Tudors were not perfect, nor were they the villains of Victorian propaganda. They were human, ambitious, flawed, brilliant, and dangerous. By looking past the myths, we can understand the people behind the portraits, the decisions behind the scandals, and the lives behind the headlines. History isn't just what we're told, it's what we uncover. So next time you hear a juicy Tudor tale, ask yourself, is it fact or centuries-old gossip?